This is the boat tour. Can you hear me okay in the back?
Uh-huh.
Once we get moving, I'll be talking to you through an amplified system, so I won't have to yell at you when I go down. Again, this is the boat tour. My name's Randy. I'm going to take you out onto the former rice field, and we call it a refuge, and we're going to give you a waterway perspective of a low country plantation. We start out with a brief history. South Carolina was founded in 1670 on the west bank of the Ashley River. Now this is the Ashley River, and we are on the west bank. The original settlement, however, was about 4 or 5 miles downstream that way towards the Atlantic Ocean. And it was called Charlestown Landing at the time that it was settled. 10 years later, in 1680, they relocated the settlement and they moved it down to the peninsula at the point where Charleston City is today. That peninsula is formed by the Ashley River where it meets up with the Cooper River. Those two rivers create Charleston's harbor, and then those waters flow out into the Atlantic Ocean. Now those two rivers, the Ashley and the Cooper, are named after a gentleman whose name was Anthony Ashley Cooper, and he was the Lord Proprietor of the Carolina colony back in the 1600s. Now Charleston and or South Carolina are often referred to as a colony of a colony. That's because those English settlers who sailed here in 1670 did not sail here from England. They actually came directly here from an island called Barbados, which is down in the lower eastern part of the Caribbean Sea. Years before, they had set sail from England and headed to Barbados in seek of fortune. And for a lot of reasons, it didn't turn out the way they had wanted it. Most importantly, it wasn't profitable enough, or they just couldn't make enough money. For a lot of reasons, including overpopulation, soil conditions, climate conditions. They just really couldn't sustain their operations. So once again, they packed up their ships and they sailed north, arriving here in 1670. Now when they got here, they brought with them what we call a enslaved population. And without that enslaved population, we almost certainly would not be sitting here taking a tour on Magnolia plantation today. It took an extraordinary amount of labor to eke out a plantation from what at the time was just the raw wilderness of the South Carolina colony. So when they get here, they also now are in a new territory. It's all new climate conditions, new soil conditions. They still didn't know which crops were going to be sustainable, but more importantly, again, which ones would be profitable. So they did a lot of experimenting. They tried things like olives, they tried oranges, they tried tea and indigo, to name a few, but none of those had any real great success. But within about 10 years, they came across the one crop that was not only going to survive the Carolina conditions, it would actually thrive and indeed flourish, and that was rice. And thus began the rice era of South Carolina. Now, rice did, however, pose a very significant challenge. Rice will only grow in fresh water, and it needs about 2 feet of fresh water. So if you're going to flood hundreds of acres or thousands of acres with 2 feet of fresh water, you're obviously going to need a lot of it. Now you might ask logically, why would water be an issue? Everywhere I go in the low country, I'm surrounded by water. It's true, we are, but it's not fresh water. And that brings us back to the Ashley River. The Ashley River is what we call a brackish tidal river. Brackish means that we're at a point on the river where in this general region, salt water comes up from the Atlantic Ocean upstream, and it meets with fresh water, which comes downstream from the interior of South Carolina. And in this region, along the river, it mixes and combines. It's called brackish, or again, a combination of fresh and salt water. It's called a tidal river because you might well know that anywhere on our planet, we see the evidence around coastal areas of 4 tide cycles that happen every 24 hours. You have 2 high tides and you have 2 low tides. And what they determined was that through observation, they were able to figure out as tidal currents get near the end of a cycle, they begin to slow. And eventually the current stops. That's called slack tide. Then those tidal currents reverse their direction and the water goes back out. So that's the rise and the fall, or the ebb and flow of a natural tidal cycle. they also figured out was that as tidal currents get near the end of the cycle, when they're slowing, and indeed when they're stopped at slack tide, salt water is heavier than fresh water. So the salt water sinks to the bottom and the fresh water flows in over top of it. So twice a day at high slack tide, the entire surface of this river was covered with a massive, thick layer of fresh water. So the answer to the question, where would they get sufficient quantities of fresh water to flood thousands of acres, was resolved. It's right out there twice a day at slack high tide. Now a rice field has to be completely contained by some kind of a wall or a barrier or what have you. The path that you came down on today is on top of what we call a levee. The levee has one purpose. It's to keep fresh water in here and salt water out there. If you were to allow salt water to get into an active producing rice field, it would render the field useless for over 2 years. So it would have been catastrophic. So if you think about that, what that means then is that this levee had to be higher than the absolute highest that river could ever get to eliminate the possibility of any salt water getting in here. So now they had a second challenge. How were they going to get the water over the levee and into here? The answer lies in those two wooden structures right there on the path. Those are not operable, they're replicas, they're not real, but they're called water gates or water trunks. And they're real simple. There's a gate on the outside of the levee, and there's a gate on the inside of the levee. They had to connect them by some means of passing water through the levee. There was no pipe manufacturers. They couldn't go down to a store and buy a piece of pipe. They actually would cut down cypress trees, and they'd carve out the center of the tree, or hollow out the center of the tree, making, in effect, a very large wooden pipe. So the outside gate was positioned just below the high tide level, and it was attached to the outside of the pipe. The pipe came through the levee, and there was another gate attached to the inside. So twice a day at high slack tide, if they needed fresh water, they simply would open up those gates, and in would flow all of that fresh water that's floating on top of the river out there. It's also referred to as sweet water. You'll hear that name quite a bit. Sweet water, fresh water, they're the same thing. It's of interest to note, I think, as well, that technology came with the Western Africans, the slaves that they brought with them from West Africa to Barbados and then from Barbados to here. The West Africans had been cultivating rice for thousands of years, and without that knowledge, the plantation owners would not have survived the whole process. They wouldn't have known how to actually grow rice in a flooded coastal region such as we have here. So. Okay, the boat. I'm required to tell you a little bit about the boat. Number one, it's a very safe and secure boat. I hope when you came aboard you didn't feel like you had to grab a hold or anything. It's very secure. It's called a pontoon boat. There's 2 large pontoons filled with foam flotation material. We have 3 life jackets under each and every one of your seats, and we have a fire extinguisher, and we have a throw ring or a life ring back there. So I'm going to be driving the boat. I'm going to be talking to you about the history. I'm going to be talking to you about nature. And if I see that one of you have gotten overheated and you decide to jump over the side and go for a swim, I'm going to stop the boat. I'm going to throw that ring to you, and I'm going to pull you up, and we're going to get you back in your seat. I want you to clearly understand something. I'm not coming in the water to help you. I don't see too many serious faces, but I'm just kidding. I hope to show you in a few minutes why you don't really want to swim in these waters. Any questions at all? I'll be talking to you through an amplified system. I'll be driving the boat. We have a pretty full crowd. It's a little tough to answer questions sometimes. Don't let that stop you. I'll try to answer them. If I can't while we're moving, I'll answer them when we get back to the dock. Last instructions, I'm going to ask you all to stay seated. Keep your hands and arms completely inside this railing. As soon as we get away from the dock and we're facing that way, you can get up, walk around, and do whatever you'd like. The 5 of you up front. Any objection if I leave this gate open? Okay. 2 reasons. It allows you and everybody else to see things you wouldn't otherwise see that are swimming out here in front of us. But I'm also very selfish as a captain. It's better if I can see the dock when I come in. Because if I hit it going too fast, the 5 of you are going for a swim out there. let me get started and we'll get going and see what we can find out there.